Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the fifth and the final panel session for the session entitled Water Crisis in the West, Thinking Like a Watershed. Hello, my name is Craig Newbill, and I'm the Executive Director with the New Mexico Humanities Council. And tonight it is a real pleasure for me to introduce the moderator for tonight's panel, who will then introduce the panelists for the discussion. Tonight's panel, Privatizing Our Water Resources, is made possible with funding support from the New Mexico Humanities Council, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Christensen Fund, the Historic Chemo Theater, and the Lore of the Land Incorporated, a nonprofit organization based in Santa Fe. Now, I've introduced these lectures 4 times without properly acknowledging the Lore of the Land. That's Jack's nonprofit. And so I want to tell you what they do because it's a wonderful resource. Besides the digital copies of what's going on in this lecture series, he's got hundreds of oral history projects, other water projects. All of the information is on the website for free, and he encourages people to use what they need. So I want you to know the Lore of the Land Incorporated trained scholars within the indigenous and traditional communities in the practice of oral history and the art of sound collage. Lore of the Land, Inc. produces radio programs for distribution and broadcast over community public radio stations. Lore of the Land produces sound collages for museums and also produces and distributes CDs, books, and articles, all of which focus on the relationship of cultural diversity to biodiversity. Lore of the Land also facilitates and supports the importance of collaboration between indigenous culture bearers and members of the scientific community. So really, without Lore of the Land and Jack Loefller, we would not be here tonight. So Jack, my apologies for not boosting the presence of Lore of the Land in this series. At this point, this lecture series has examined human habitation and water use in the Southwest. Panelists have discussed indigenous perspectives to include sacred, secular, and economically oriented attitudes about the relationship between human culture and habitat. In each panel, the speakers have continued to address this relationship between humans and the environment. This relationship between humans and the environment makes this lecture series a humanities discussion as compared to a policy discussion solely based on empirical data and science. Every panel in this series has addressed global change and climate instability. The speakers have continued to present a cultural mosaic of perspectives that articulate a number of viewpoints held by speakers concerning nature and homeland. Tonight, this series continues to examine the ties between habitat and humans. In previous panels, we have looked at scarcity of water above and below ground level and explored water scarcity due to global warming, climate instability, drought, and over-extraction. So to repeat one last time for clarification of where we are going and where we have been, we are discussing ideas and perspectives in these panel discussions. We are not relying on raw data and a quantitative analysis which will ultimately solve our water problems. We are not advocating one particular point of view or solution, but are discussing historic events, cultural practices, and current and future policy decisions as they relate to water. Tonight's panel discussion includes 3 speakers who are distinguished writers, thinkers, and include a water policy administrator whose agency promotes water conservation, recycling, and reuse. They will be introduced by the panel moderator and project director for these public programs, Jack Loefller. Jack is an author, radio producer, oral historian, and a southwestern water scholar. His radio series and individual programs include Moving Waters, the Colorado River and the West, a 7-state project of upper and lower basin states funded by the State Humanities Councils and the NEH. And I know this is on the Lore of the Land site. Books written by Jack include Thinking Like a Watershed, Survival Along the Continental Divide, and Healing the West, Voices of Culture and Habitat. Please join me in welcoming Jack Loefller.
Thank you, Brother Craig. Hello, and thank you, our loyal audience, for coming yet again. It is really nice of you to come, and this is the last one of this particular series. Once again, we have our John Wesley Powell map here, rendered by Powell back in 1888 through 90, around and through there, and what he has done on this map is show the watersheds of the American West. And it was his idea that we organize the West by watersheds rather than by the strange geopolitically bounded state lines that we have today. And had we done that, we certainly would have been a lot more conscious about water use in the West. One of the things that Powell vigorously argued against, and I've mentioned this before and before, is he thought that inter-basin transfers of water were absolutely the wrong thing to do. And I concur, because it creates a false sense of water security. Well, this evening, our last panel, we're doing sort of a wrap. Our first panel tried to provide an overview of what was happening throughout the American West water-wise, especially the American Southwest, with a special focus on both the Colorado River watershed and the Rio Grande watershed. But we shouldn't exclude the other watersheds in New Mexico. I'm going to show you, point them out again. Over here is the Canadian River watershed, which actually, ultimately, the few little drops that we have here in New Mexico, maybe some of them get all the way to the Mississippi. Here is the Pecos River watershed. Our last panel, one of our people was M. Hall, who had done a book called High and Dry, which focused on the Rio Pecos watershed. And then here, this green one, that's us. And we're right in here. And then over here, there's the Colorado River watershed. And then down in here is the Gila River watershed. And just 2 weeks ago, I was down in Silver City talking to my friend Allison Seawick down there, who is trying vigorously to stop what she regards, and many of us do, as an improper attempt to rearrange the flow of the Gila River. These are all things that we have to think about. One of the things that I'm going to say right now, and then this will be the last thing I say, for a while anyway, is that I subscribe to the New Scientist magazine, which is a wonderful magazine. And in a recent issue, there was a book review of Fritjof Capra's new book, which addresses systems thinking with regard to looking at biology. In other words, how everything is interrelated. And that's precisely what we've tried to do with this series of panels. We've tried to present the different components of the whole picture. And it's that whole picture that we have to look at, in my opinion, before we start making these King Solomon decisions about how we're going to legislate the use of water. And so with that, I'm going to introduce our wonderful array of panelists this evening. Come on out, gang. Here's John Fleck, who writes for the Albuquerque Journal, science editor for the Albuquerque Journal, and Sonia Dickey, who is a wonderful writer who's written extensively about the Central Arizona Project, about Glen Canyon, and Mike Hamman, who is our area director for the Bureau of Reclamation here. Our panel. And we're really lucky to have this array of people. Earlier today, the three of them, was that me or was that?
That was me.
Oh.
Just making sure it's on.
Gesundheit. They appeared up at KNME. Megan Kamrick, who has come to many of our panels here, filmed interviews with them discussing some of the issues they're going to be talking about tonight. I wasn't invited up there, so I didn't get to come. So I don't know what they're going to say. But at any rate, I have an idea. We'll begin with John Fleck. John, go right ahead.
Thank you much. Thanks for all coming out this evening. I love that map, and it has always fascinated me, but there's something about it that I didn't notice until last time, the last one of these sessions that Jack had, that John Wesley Powell, when he made that map, made the same mistake that we in the United States have been making for more than a century, which is he stops the map at the US-Mexico border. And the watershed of the Colorado River doesn't stop at the US-Mexico border. You see that little white line slipping down toward the Gulf of California Sea of Cortez? That's what used to be the Colorado River Delta. It used to be a magnificent ecosystem, 1 million acres of cottonwoods and willows and salt marshes and wetlands. And as we dammed the Colorado River over the course of the 20th century, first with Hoover Dam in the 1930s and then with Glen Canyon Dam, we slowly but surely starved that ecosystem of water so that by the late 1980s and 1990s, the only time water ever got to the delta anymore is when Glen Canyon Dam and Hoover Dam were full and the spillways ran. They call it fill and spill. And the only time that ecosystem received water was filling and spilling. And the last time that we really had fill and spill was in the late 1990s. So since then, you have 100 miles of what used to be the most magnificent estuary and river delta ecosystems in North America completely dried of water. And there's a place along the river, the Colorado River, which I first visited on a reporting trip 4 years ago, just outside of Yuma, called Morelos Dam. And it's the last dam on the Colorado River. And I was meeting with Jennifer McCloskey, who runs the Bureau of Reclamation office down there, to talk to her about some water management issues and interview her for some work I was doing. And she said, well, you really ought to drive the levee. And what you have there is a 20-mile stretch where the Colorado River forms the border between the United States and Mexico. And on the US side, there's a levee road, which is extremely well maintained because the Border Patrol uses it as their patrol area. She said, you've got to drive the levee. It's really interesting, John. So she showed me how to get out to the levee from her office over this series of little dirt roads. Started driving down the levee, and you follow the Colorado River, kind of makes a sweeping bend out of Yuma, and you get to Morelos Dam, and the Colorado River stops. No dam that's doing that is a perfect seal, so there's a little bit of water leaking, there's a little pool on the downstream side, and kind of a little narrow channel that kind of filters down for about a mile and a half before it disappears in the sand completely. And then you're driving down this levee alongside scrub desert and really scraggy looking tamarisk. And the Colorado River, this river that I'd been around my whole life, that's been a passion of mine since I was a little kid, it stops. And that's such a dramatic thing to see. Well, in March of this year, March 23rd, I was back at Morelos Dam, sitting on the downstream side, over on the Mexican side, with a little group of diehard environmentalists and water managers and government officials from Mexico and the United States, a little group of about 100, 150. We're on the downstream side, down in the Colorado River Channel, downstream from Morelos Dam, and we watched them open Gate 11 and start letting water through Morelos Dam. And it was the first time, it's believed to be the first time anywhere in the world that an environmental flow across an international border was done purely for purposes of benefiting the environment. And it was a spectacular thing to see. For weeks following the water down, you know, the communities having water returned to their river, the wildlife. It was just a spectacular thing to see. And it was a little experiment, but I think it's important to understand how and why it happened, because I think it says a lot about where we are going and where the opportunities are to succeed in solving the problems that we've been talking about in these last 4 sessions. Lake Mead is on the verge of, sometime next month, it will drop to the lowest level that it's been in history. Well, since they filled it. I mean, it used to not be a lake at all. But since they filled it in the 1930s. You know, we're about I was looking at the numbers today, we're about 1.5 feet away, and it, you know, it's dropping slowly, slowly, slowly. There's extreme tension in the lower Colorado River Basin among various water users, especially between Arizona and California. Las Vegas is extremely vulnerable because as Lake Mead drops, their water supply is at risk because of their intake pipes in Lake Mead. And yet, in the face of all of that, 100,000 acre-feet was run down the river as an environmental, political, and public policy experiment. And that's an enormously hopeful thing, and it's worth talking about how it happened and why it happened, because it's a model for the way we're going to solve problems going forward, or the way we may fail if we don't succeed at doing this. So we have structural shortfalls. There's less water in the Colorado River than everybody believed there was when they did the dividing of the water. So communities like Albuquerque and Santa Fe and Phoenix and Denver and the farmers of the Imperial Valley and Yuma have all come, and in Mexicali and the San Luis Valley have all come to depend on a water supply that's not big enough for all of them. There's an enormous history of tension between the United States and Mexico. For a long time, the United States asserted the position that we didn't have any obligation to give them any water. We signed a treaty with them in 1944 that gave them 10% of what they used to get, but we didn't agree about the water quality, so we just started delivering really salty water to them, and there's enormous difficulties, enormous tensions between the two nations, and yet over the course of the last 12 years, 13, 14 years, an agreement was negotiated that allowed an environmental flow to go back into the delta to meet the environmental needs down in Mexico. So how did this happen? And this is an example of how deals, agreements, collaboration can finally work in the Colorado River. And the people who've worked on this believe that this is a model. So how did it happen? There was a giant earthquake, a big earthquake in Mexicali in 2010. The earthquake damaged Mexican irrigation system. The Mexicans couldn't take their full delivery of irrigation water. Mexico and the United States negotiated a very quick agreement that temporarily Mexican water that wasn't going to be used in their irrigation system because it was broken could be stored in Lake Mead. Las Vegas loves this. It keeps Lake Mead up, keeps the water above their intakes. So Las Vegas benefits. Mexico benefits because they have the ability to store some extra water. At the same time, Los Angeles is short of water. They're looking for new sources of water. And folks from the Metropolitan Water District just start to talk to folks in Mexico. How could we help you help pay for efficiency improvements in your irrigation system? Maybe we could get some of the water, you get more water for your irrigation system. So you've got that going on. You've got environmentalists who are trying to figure out how to put more water in the delta itself, and the stars aligned, and people crafted this deal where the cities benefit in America. We're rich. We're rich enough to help pay for irrigation system improvements in Mexico. The Mexican farmers get a more efficient system. The Mexican farmers, there's a strong desire on the part of the farmers in Mexico to see some water return to the river that flows through their midst. So suddenly you have rich urban users in the United States acting as advocates for the environment and the farmers in Mexico, because it's the kind of thing where everybody benefits. Over a period of years, this complicated deal got negotiated, and it has a bunch more components that made how to share shortages on the Colorado River between Mexico and the United States, how to share surpluses. And it's the kind of Byzantine Rube Goldberg solution that comes from everybody who's trying to share this scarce resource, realizing fighting over this resource isn't going to work anymore. Instead, we have to figure out how to collaborate if we're still going to have the cities we want to live in and the farms we want to grow our food, and in the course of this, some water that we can leave in the rivers themselves for an environmental flow. It was a little experiment. This could fail. We need more water in future years. We need money. Environmental groups are helping to raise money to pay for additional farm improvements to free up water for these environmental flows. But it's a baby step, and it's how we learn how to do this sharing. When started talking to Jack about doing these panels, at first I didn't like the title, the word crisis in this title. But I went to my dictionary as I was thinking about talking, and a couple of definitions: a time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger. Probably yes, maybe not danger. I don't know, but certainly intense difficulty and trouble. But a time when difficult or important decisions must be made, and yes, absolutely. So I'm cool with crisis now.
That was Craig Newbill's idea.
I'm cool, Craig, wherever you are, I'm cool with crisis now. But the other thing is thinking like a watershed, and I think it's really important to understand how we need to frame thinking like a watershed now, and what this little experiment of an environmental flow in the Colorado River Delta can tell us about that now, because what we have done is kind of blown up John Wesley's Powell's idea. I mean, first of all, we did it by drawing these arbitrary lines for governance that are not along borders, but we've also taken water from the Colorado River watershed. And for better or for worse, and I know Jack and others argue that it was a terrible idea, but it's a thing that's done now. We've moved water to Denver, and we've moved water to Albuquerque, Santa Fe and Albuquerque in the Middle Rio Grande Valley, out of that basin and into this basin. We've moved water to Los Angeles. We've moved water to the farms of the Imperial Valley, and we've done an amazing amount of water moving in and around California, so that suddenly all these communities are tied together in this common community of water-using interests. So we've created this uber watershed, this giant watershed that stretches all the way from Albuquerque to Sacramento and Los Angeles and Denver. And the only way we solve problems now is if we think like that whole watershed, and we realize that the folks in Denver and the folks in Albuquerque and the folks down in San Luis Rio, Colorado, in Sonora, that we all share this common interest, and we get beyond the fighting over water, which is a long-standing tradition, and figure out how to collaboratively share. And I think the experiment in the Delta that I just seen is a really hopeful example that is in fact possible.
Thank you, John. Wow, that was a really positive thing we just heard. Mutual cooperation instead of mutual antagonism, which Peter Kropotkin thought was the only way to proceed, who was my hero, by the way. No, that was really great. And maybe we'll get back into a little bit of this during the actual panel discussion. But our second speaker, who knows a heap about water, actually, Mike Hamman and I were on the Rio Chama together about 6 months ago, más o menos. And what was really funny is that it hadn't rained, and it hadn't rained, and we got on the river, and it let go big time for hours, and it was terrific. But at any rate, our second speaker is Mike Hamman, who's area director for the Bureau of Reclamation here in I have a hard time with words. The Bureau of Reclamation here in this region, and he knows more about the ins and outs of water than I do, that's for sure. But Mike, please, thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you. Well, and as you recall, Jack, when the water was coming, there was no wind, and it was coming straight down and popping like pearls on the calm river. It was pretty amazing.
It was great.
Yeah. I think I'm the only federal agency representative that has been on your group of panels, so I relish the opportunity to give you folks a bit of the federal perspective, at least from Bureau of Reclamation's point of view, within New Mexico, and you know, we actually, you know, our area office follows the map of John Wesley Powell's for the Rio Grande and the Pecos and the Canadian. So at least the way we're organized is along the basin stratosphere. But I'd like to follow what John was saying in terms of what's going on in the Colorado River. Is there was a compact negotiated between the 7 states in 1922, and we also have a similar situation that is the treaties for what we do in the Rio Grande. And that's the Rio Grande Compact that was negotiated in 1938. And that's kind of where the differences, or that's where the similarities end. I think if you look at the Colorado River Compact, it basically has a huge reclamation presence with the Colorado River Storage Project, all the dams and the power production and all the things that went with that particular reclamation effort. And it also has the Secretary of Interior as the river master, so to speak, there, guiding with a guiding hand of some kind, working with all the states and all the other interests. So in the Rio Grande system, it's really defers to the states. Each state administers their component of their activities to meet the requirements of the compact. They have a certain amount of flow that passes a gauge, and then they need to, of that, a certain percentage needs to be delivered to the downstream state in accordance with the way that compact was organized. And it was done in a time of fairly wet periods, and what we now know is a longer history of really serious drought cycles in the prehistory times from tree ring research and that type of activity. So we do know that particular hydrology is what drives the use of the water. And we also, one of the reasons the compact was put into place is the Rio Grande was over-appropriated by the turn of the 20th century. So the way that all the states have dealt with things differently. Both New Mexico, well, Colorado is required to deliver at the border for New Mexico, and then New Mexico has an index gauge, and they deliver down to Elephant Butte for Texas. And the way that Colorado has gone about their business in terms of meeting their requirements was that there was during the compact itself is really an elegant document. I mean, it's very well designed based on the hydrology they knew about, but it was tested in the 50s. Both Colorado and New Mexico went into extreme debt to the downstream states, and Colorado went about it in a to get themselves back into compliance. They went and adjudicated the entire basin, and they now administer their water activities on the basis of priority administration, and when they need to, they cut off the junior water users to make the required deliveries. And since the 60s, they've been able to do that. However, they were still in debt to the compact, so how Reclamation functions in this area is we fill in the gaps to support the Rio Grande Compact. And in Colorado's instance, we built the closed basin water salvage project, which allowed for, over time, to pump that water that was normally lost to evapotranspiration in the closed basin, to pump it out and deliver it to the border to help Colorado meet its long-term debt. Well, lo and behold, around 1985, there was a spill at Elephant Butte, and their debt was wiped out. So now the Closed Basin Project is utilized to help them continue to manage their water resources up there and to meet their compact obligations. Now, New Mexico took on a different strategy, and it's kind of multifaceted. They are adjudicating a lot of the tributaries in and around northern New Mexico. Rio Chama is close to being completed for their adjudication. Some of the most senior acequia water rights, late 1600s, early 1700s, are in the Rio Chama area. And those have been adjudicated. And then they're also focusing on Indian water rights settlements in the Taos area and also in the Powahki Basin. But they have not tackled the big process of adjudicating the main stem. The strategy there is to work, the Reclamation works very closely with the state of New Mexico, with our river maintenance program, and also managing the Middle Rio Grande project in order to maximize the delivery of sediment and water through the system. And it's I wouldn't call it necessarily a passive process, but what it is it's maximizing the efficiency of water return, so it helps New Mexico meet their compact delivery requirements. And in the 1950s, we also built the low-flow conveyance channel that did the same thing. So there's another instance where Reclamation played a role, but it's filling in a gap that assisted the states to meet their needs. And then in 1970, we closed the gates at Heron Lake and began diverting water from this, as you mentioned, from the Colorado River Basin for the purposes of meeting several needs, M&I, for Albuquerque and Santa Fe and other smaller communities up and down the Rio Grande. And also, it was set up so that it gave the Middle Valley here another resource to help in a way. It bought about 40 years for the state of New Mexico to continue to meet its compact obligations. And it also gave them another tool to control junior groundwater pumping, to offset junior groundwater pumping within the basin that the city of Albuquerque and other municipalities have been doing to meet their demands. But I think as we look at that resource, most of the cities are now developing it. It's taken this long, some 40 years, for the cities to really figure out. They've been able to survive on their, I guess, dewatering the aquifers, and now it's time for them. They realize that they need to use surface water as their checking account, so to speak, and convert and allow for the groundwater to become their savings account for a drought period. So both Albuquerque and Santa Fe have shifted their approach to diverting surface water directly from the Rio Grande, and the San Juan Chama water allows them that opportunity to do so. So it also serves as another resource for the Bureau of Reclamation to lease to meet the Endangered Species Act requirements for the silvery minnow and the southwestern willow flycatcher. They were listed in the early 90s, and Reclamation has been working very closely with the Middle Rio Grande ESA collaborative program to try and develop strategies to not only meet the requirements that the Fish and Wildlife Service has imposed with the biological opinion, helped by some federal court actions as well, to try and achieve that balance of creating a riverine system that will continue to support the endangered species. And we've been able to capitalize on the San Juan Chama project, the surpluses that are in it, but that is a diminishing opportunity.
Is it?
So really it's about time for us to actually elevate the process that we've been doing thus far. It's been about a 10-year period that we've been working under the collaborative program envelope, and we've had 16 different entities that were working closely together to try to keep that balance of meeting the existing human needs as well as trying to improve the ecological condition of the Rio Grande below Cochiti Dam down to Elephant Butte. So the San Juan Chama project has played a really vital role in that we've actually sent in the 12-year period that we've been working on this, roughly 750,000 acre-feet down the river to support the endangered species activities and to create a good living habitat there. But yet we have been unable to actually remove the silvery minnow off the jeopardy status that it currently has. And it's primarily hydrologic driven, but we also have a degraded baseline situation with the channelization of the river, the levee system, and also the lack of administrative flexibility in the system that our federal projects currently have. That's one of the processes that has unfolded over time, is that each of Reclamation's projects have been authorized in a point in time for a specific set of circumstances. With not, as you said earlier, not with a really long-term foresight in terms of how things could change in terms of long-term water shortages, possible, Endangered Species Act issues that we couldn't foresee. So they're a lot of our projects are single-purpose authority-driven. There's incidental benefits that go with those, but what we would like to do, and what I think it's going to take a strong effort to do, is to follow the example that John pointed out that's going on in the Colorado system, is for us to get together fully analyze what are the total possibilities within the entire watershed. That includes the federal projects and the state's abilities to manage their compact obligations in a way that allows us to recalibrate the system to meet the ecological needs and continue to meet the demands in a declining, and the possibility of a declining snow melt runoff environment. With some of the signs that our folks are working on is possibility of some short and long-term climate change analysis that could shift the balance from a snowmelt runoff-driven system into maybe more of a monsoonal-driven type water supply for the basin. San Juan Chama is probably the least vulnerable. If you look basin-wide, San Juan Chama is probably, this project is the most least vulnerable to the shortages, but even there we see a 15% shortage over the next 40 or 50 years that the climate models are saying might occur. So we need, you know, it's incumbent upon Reclamation to try to inform folks of this possibilities, take a look at all the options that are available to us. If it takes reauthorization of projects, if it takes different analysis, you know, different systems that could better capitalize on the new hydrologic regime, and also with an eye towards improving the ecological systems that these, you know, dams and traditional water operations has degraded over time. So that, I feel very optimistic based on my tenure as the area manager over the last 4 years, that folks are getting that more holistic view and wanting to expand our flexibilities and our understanding of the system so that we can meet these very huge challenges that we see coming before us. But like I said, it's a trying time, but I'm also very optimistic that if we can keep out of federal court and focus our attentions on the things at hand, I think we might be able to make some progress.
Beautiful, Mike. Wow, we've had two optimists tonight.
And then there's me.
What a whopper. Really quickly, Mike, just if you can give us a brief answer, but how's the health of the aquifers overall in New Mexico right now?
Well, most of my experience is in the Middle Rio Grande systems, and they have been, you know, there was alarm bells going off, particularly in the Albuquerque area with the heavy cone of depression and the possibility of even land subsidence in the Northeast Heights and all those types of things. So that was one of the reasons why Albuquerque and Santa Fe and other communities are looking at weaning themselves off of groundwater as their daily, you know, checking account, so to speak, and allowing them to recharge. And talking to John Stomp with the Utility Authority, he said that they've seen a dramatic rise in the water tables since they've been using their direct diversion of surface water. And Santa Fe's also on that same path as well.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Mike. Wow. Happiness. Okay. And our third panelist is an old friend, Sonia Dickey, whom I've known for quite a number of years now, who has, well, her dissertation for her PhD really got into a whole bunch of stuff that's been fascinating to me for a long time, that revolved around Glen Canyon Dam and the effect of that kind of stuff on the indigenous peoples of the area. And she wrote a beautiful chapter for our book, Thinking Like a Watershed, which we don't happen to have any of here tonight. I wish we did. Where she focused on the Central Arizona Project, which to me is a strange model unto its own. But at any rate, Sonia Dickey.
Thank you, Jack. I'm basically going to give you a stripped-down version of that, a very stripped-down version of that chapter this evening. In the mid-1960s, when Peabody Coal initially obtained mining leases from both the Navajo and Hopi tribal councils to extract coal, Many Navajos still lived in isolated family groups and hogans scattered along the backside of Black Mesa, where they herded sheep, goats, and horses. Likewise, traditional Hopis inhabited the escarpment's southern promontories, raising corn, beans, and squash, just as their ancestors had done for generations. Once a Pleistocene lake, Black Mesa now resembles a human hand tracing the contours of this ancient body of water. For thousands of years, vibrant forest and aquatic plant life embraced the ancient lake before decaying into a bog that over time hardened to 21 billion tons of high-grade, low-sulfur coal, the female mountain's lungs according to Dene mythology, and one of the largest and richest coal deposits in the United States. Seams 3 to 18 inches thick reach the surface, allowing Peabody to employ both surface and strip mining techniques in its quest for the raw material. Peabody's relentless raising of Black Mesa in search of coal severely eroded the region's soil, reducing its fertility, polluted or in some cases depleted the area's rivers and streams, including sacred springs fed by the Navajo aquifer that support Hopi land's first, second, and third mesas, destroyed native plants and animals, and resulted in the forced removal of hundreds of Navajos from their traditional homeland, the largest Indian removal since the U.S. government officially abandoned the practice at the end of the 19th century. Enormous drag lines and bulldozers raped and pillaged the land, terrorizing its native inhabitants whose families had lived there for generations. Indeed, oral historian Jack Loefller, co-founder of the Black Mesa Defense Fund, witnessed Peabody Coal bulldoze an elderly woman's hogan. The woman's world of a lifetime, he writes, disappeared before her weeping eyes in a cloud of dust, and then she was homeless. Strip mining on Black Mesa is intricately tied to the multi-layered, interconnected history of indigenous water rights, water reclamation, and the privatization of natural resources in the American Southwest. Plans for various infrastructure projects began in the region in earnest at the turn of the 20th century and culminated during the Cold War with the passage of the Colorado River Storage Project Act of 1956, promoting Glen Canyon Dam as its sensational star, and Congress's approval of the long-awaited Central Arizona Project as part of the Colorado River Basin Project Act of 1968. Federal laws and interstate projects historically ignored indigenous claims to the region's rivers and streams, and these two laws differed in no significant way from their predecessors, especially considering the tremendous growth the Southwest witnessed during the post-World War II era. The Cold War essentially propelled federal expenditures in the region as the Department of Defense consumed the area's open space to support its military bases, naval shipyards, Air Force landing strips, and nuclear test sites. Defense spending had ignited a firestorm of development, rapidly spreading to southwestern urban centers. Phoenix proved the most remarkable. By the mid-1950s, Arizona ranked as the fastest growing state in the Union, and Phoenix stood poised for a long, explosive boom. City planners set all the machinery in place in order to attract new settlers, civic boosters, primarily financed by military spending and the aeronautics industry, spearheaded capital improvements and development projects, including roads, airports, housing initiatives, water supplies, sewer systems, and parks. Yet business leaders and congressmen surmised that although Phoenix still lacked capital, the city's water needs had reached critical mass. Arizona is at a crisis point, Senator Carl Hayden testified at the CAP hearings in 1963. The state urgently needs more water to meet her rapidly expanding domestic requirements, end quote. Indeed, the Grand Canyon state demanded water and electricity to illuminate its developing cities. Conveniently, Phoenix rested on the edge of the Colorado Plateau, a rich storehouse of natural resources and home to the nation's largest native communities, both crucial for a colonialist system dependent on Indian assets to feed the dominant culture. From 1963 to 1968, Arizona's political players, including Secretary of the Interior Stuart Udall, Senators Hayden and Barry M. Goldwater, and Representatives John J. Rhodes and Morris, or Mo Udall, Stewart's younger brother and successor in the House, revived the state's long-standing fight for a federally funded Central Arizona project to pump water from the Colorado River uphill to the state's Central Valley. Their plans included dams on both ends of the Grand Canyon. The idea of flooding the Grand Canyon ignited a firestorm of controversy among environmental groups, spearheaded by Sierra Club Executive Director David Brower, and no doubt Stuart Udall's post as Interior Secretary bolstered the Grand Canyon State position within President Johnston's administration. Arizona's native communities played an important part too. Both environmentalists and CAP enthusiasts wooed the Wallapai and Navajo nations in an attempt to obtain indigenous support for their respective agendas. Ultimately, they wanted to influence public opinion on debates surrounding the Central Arizona Project, as both sides used Native people to play on the nation's sensitivities towards civil rights. Although Stuart Udall and his posse promised the Wallapais tremendous economic benefits from Bridge Canyon Dam, they never offered the Navajo Nation compensation for a structure at Marble Canyon. Goldwater told geographer Stephen C. Jett, a young professor at the University of California, Davis at the time, that as far as he knew, the Navajos possessed no legal rights to Marble Canyon and had not been consulted. The senator admitted that the Department of the Interior refused to acknowledge Dene claims to the site. The failure of CAP devotees to include the country's largest Indian nation as beneficiaries arguably hindered the advancement of their dam agenda. To make matters worse, CAP lobbyists had agreed to pay the Wallapai $16 million for the construction of Bridge Canyon Dam on their land near Peach Springs, Arizona, while denying Navajo claims to the Marble Canyon site. Their actions infuriated Navajo Tribal Chairman Raymond Nakai and other Dene leaders, convincing them to reconsider their support for hydroelectric dams in Grand Canyon. The Navajo Council backed proposals calling for a dam at Marble Canyon as late as 1961, when Arizona still planned on constructing a state-funded Central Arizona project. On May 3, 1967, however, Nakai wrote New Mexico Senator Clinton P. Anderson, chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Water and Power Resources, outlining the Tribal Council's new stance. In his letter, Chairman Nakai expressed frustration with both the Arizona Power Authority and the Federal Power Commission, state and federal entities charged at different times with constructing and maintaining a dam at Marble Canyon, and the agency's refusal to offer the Navajos, quote, reasonable compensation, quote, for the use of their land. The chairman then dropped a bombshell. 9 months earlier, on August 3, 1966, the Navajo Tribal Council, asserting Dene rights as a sovereign nation, had passed Resolution CAU 9766, insisting the proposed dam would flood 46 miles of scenic reservation land. Our resolution makes quite clear, Tribal Councilwoman Annie Dodge-Wanika contended, that the great expenditures contemplated for the two dams are wholly unnecessary. Instead, the Navajo Tribal Council wanted to exploit, quote, the huge deposits of coal buried in the Four Corners and on Black Mesa. We have learned, Wanika told the press, that hydropower cannot possibly compete with cheaper thermoelectric plants stoked with reservation coal, and we have concluded agreements with Peabody Coal Company and Utah Construction Company for burning Navajo coal to power what are probably the largest, and this is my insertion, and dirtiest plants in the country. On February 1, 1964, Peabody Coal Company's predecessor in interest, Century Royalty Company, signed a 10-year lease with the Navajo Tribal Council to extract Black Mesa's coal. According to lease number 8580, Century Royalty agreed to pay the Navajo Nation a variable rate ranging from 25 cents to 37.5 cents per ton of coal sold and utilized off the reservation in exchange for the right to mine approximately 25,000 acres of Navajo land on Black Mesa near Kayenta, Arizona. When coal from the Kayenta mine remained on the reservation, the Dene pocketed between 20 and 30 cents per ton, depending on the total amount sold. In addition, Century Royalty rented the Kayenta mine from the Navajos for $1 per acre per year for the agreement's first 5 years. In other words, the Navajo tribe initially received $125,000 for the use of their land, excluding any royalties from the sale of coal. Finally, Century Royalty agreed to hire Navajo Indians when available for all positions, with one caveat: the company or leasee judged the qualifications of potential workers. At relatively the same time as the Navajo Tribal Council entered negotiations with Century Royalty, Secretary Udall realized that legislation for a Central Arizona project must contain alternative sources of power. The Navajos' rejection of Marble Canyon Dam, combined with fierce public outcry over inundating parts of the Grand Canyon, persuaded the Secretary to consider other possibilities for fueling the cap. Although Udall asked his interior underlings to explore alternative options for energy production, He knew about the mining lease between Century Royalty and the Navajo Nation prior to the Navajo Tribal Council's announcement of its plans for the tribe's coal deposits. The Indian Mineral Leasing Act of 1938 required the Secretary's approval of all agreements between Native peoples and commercial enterprises, since the federal government holds Indian lands in trust, and in an effort to ensure Indian communities, quote, received maximum profits, end quote, and a lease's terms represented, quote, their best interest. In May 1965, Commissioner of Indian Affairs Felio Nash sent Secretary Udall a memo informing him that Peabody had proposed to install 2 coal-fired steam generating units of 1,000 megawatts each, and had requested to use approximately 2,000 acres of Navajo land close to Lake Powell for the new plant. In addition, Peabody anticipated burning up to 6 million tons of Black Mesa coal per year and needing 40,000 acre-feet of water annually to operate the generating station. The latter would no doubt come from Arizona's, read the Navajos' heretofore unused yearly apportionment of 50,000 acre-feet of Colorado River water allotted to the Grand Canyon State by the Upper Colorado River Basin Compact of 1948. In addition, based on the royalty rates summarized in its agreement with Century Royalty, the Navajo Tribal Council would potentially receive at least $1.2 million each year from Black Mesa's coal fields. The Navajo Tribal Council signed a second 10-year mining lease with Century Royalty Company on June 6, 1966. This time, the agreement covered mining operations on 40,000 acres of the Navajo-Hopi joint use area, 2.5 million acres of land, quote, shared between the two tribes, and the focal point of a hotly contested land dispute that erupted when Peabody Coal Company first discovered coal within JUA boundaries in 1909. The two leases totaled approximately 100 square miles, loaded with 337 million tons of coal. The raw material supplied the Mojave Generating Station at Bullhead City, Nevada for nearly 30 years, and it continues to feed the Navajo Generating Station at Page to this day. The Department of the Interior, working closely with Peabody Coal, seemingly orchestrated the industrialization of the Navajo Reservation in order to proceed with reclamation stratagems for Arizona's Central Valley. On August 17, 1966, just 2 weeks after the Tribal Council condemned the proposed Grand Canyon dams and announced their plans for Black Mesa, James H. Krieger of Best & Krieger, a California-based law firm representing Peabody's interest in the West, informed the Department of the Interior that Peabody's, quote, investor group would place the Arizona power plant, quote, next on the list, end quote, if the agency could guarantee Peabody early assurance of the water. As a bonus, Peabody estimated that construction would require approximately 300 workers. The following February, 6 months after Peabody's proposition, Udall rescinded his support for hydroelectric dams in Grand Canyon and lobbied instead for a coal-fired power plant on the Navajo Reservation abutting Lake Powell to fuel the cap. At the time, Udall adulated the benefits of mineral extraction for the Navajo Nation, but confessed years later that the whole Central Arizona project would have failed without an energy source. Since quote, nuclear power was not sufficiently advanced at the time, Udall maintained, some of the Arizona people and some of the power companies got busy and put together this Page power plant. Given Peabody's close working relationship with Western Energy Supply and Transmission Associates, a united consortium of 23 investor-owned and state, municipal, and federal electrical utilities, some of the power companies Udall referenced no doubt helped devise this new plan. Navajo leaders also realized the potential monetary benefits of extracting raw materials. In September 1966, the Arizona Republic, a Phoenix newspaper, announced an agreement authorizing the use of Black Mesa coal for the production of electricity at a coal-fired steam generating plant near Las Vegas in Clark County, Nevada. The facility, dubbed the Mojave Steam Station, would supposedly yield more than $30 million in royalties for both the Navajo and Hopi nations. Not surprising then, council members supported Udall's recommendation for a thermal generating plant near Page in lieu of hydroelectric dams to provide pumping power for the Central Arizona project. The new plant promised the Navajos jobs and additional income, longtime priorities of the Navajo Tribal Council, and guaranteed the Southwest urban centers a seemingly endless supply of electrical energy. Historian Alvin M. Josephi, Jr., who actively protested strip mining on Black Mesa during the 1970s, accused the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation of facilitating the uninhibited growth of southwestern cities. During congressional hearings for the Colorado River Storage Project, approved in 1956, for example, Reclamation had lauded Glen Canyon dams for its production of hydroelectric power, while purportedly negotiating with private utility companies for coal-fired power plants. Quote, "The Bureau had the usual self-serving reasons for busying itself with these added projects," Josephi penned in a damning piece on the murder of the Southwest, published by Audubon in the summer of 1971. "As everyone knows," he wrote, "without projects, there's no need for the agency." Indeed, Reclamation divvied up, transported, and delivered its rivers of empire through whatever means necessary to reclaim the arid Southwest, to green it up, as historian Patricia Nelson Limerick quips. In spite of Dene claims to the Colorado River, Interior assured Peabody access to Arizona's, quote, unused portion to the waterway. On December 11, 1968, the Navajo Tribal Council passed Resolution CD 10868, essentially waiving Navajo rights to Colorado River water in exchange for, quote, limited promises by a consortium of utilities to light up the reservation's hogans. The council agreed to limit Dene demands on 50,000 acre-feet of water allocated to Arizona each year under the Upper Colorado River Basin Compact of 1948. Instead, council members granted 34,100 acre-feet of the tribe's annual apportionment to the Page Power Plant in order to water its cooling towers. The tribal council mandate ostensibly negated Dene claims to the Colorado River in favor of a coal-fired power plant that promised economic security and jobs for the Navajo Nation, as well as electricity. Interestingly, fragmentary evidence suggests Secretary Udall never approved CD 10868. His failure to endorse the agreement renders it virtually ineffective and does not legally bind the tribe, freeing the Dene to claim more than 50,000 acre-feet of water for tribal lands situated in Arizona's upper basin. Today, individual members of the Navajo Nation argue that the Colorado River belongs to the Dene and holds tremendous economic potential for the tribe if their government leaders, often influenced by white lawyers, would only assert the people's rights. By May 1969, the Tribal Council had entered negotiations with a conglomerate of utility companies to lease almost 2,000 acres of reservation land for the Navajo Generating Station. According to the Navajo Times, the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority would share in the plant's electrical output. Bureau of Indian Affairs Regional Director Graham Holmes told reporters the proposal fits in with overall plans to develop the reservation. Holmes's admission highlighted the efforts of both the Department of the Interior and the Navajo Tribal Council to industrialize the reservation during the post-war era. In this case, their actions displayed utter disregard for the people living in the shadows of Peabody's draglines, those traditional Navajos and Hopis whose families had inhabited the escarpment for generations. The Salt River Project, responsible for the operation and maintenance of the power plant, built the Navajo Generating Station in 3 phases. It completed the 3rd and final unit in 1976. With smokestacks 7 stories high, the smoke-billowing monster devours 23,000 tons of coal daily and swallows 270,000 gallons of Navajo water pumped out of Lake Powell per minute. The plant delivers 2,310 megawatts of electricity to its customers via 800 miles of transmission lines marching across the desert like stormtroopers from Star Wars. Interior Secretary Udall, worried Congress would never approve CAP legislation authorizing hydroelectric dams in Grand Canyon, worked closely with Peabody and the region's utility companies to develop alternate solutions, eventually concocting the NGS to fuel the Central Arizona project. Reclamation, one of Interior's subordinate agencies, currently owns 24.3% of the electricity effusing from the Page Power Plant. While the Salt River Project claims 21.7%, Nevada Power receives 11.3%, the Arizona Public Service gets 14%, Tucson Gas and Electric maintains 7.5%, and finally, Los Angeles Water and Power holds 21.2%. The last figure evidently reflects the long-time controversy between Arizona and California over which states receives the most benefits from the Colorado River. We broke the mold with that plant, Secretary Udall reminisced years later.
Thank you. Boy, that's one of the most complex issues in the American Southwest. And one of the things that thank you so much, Sonia. One of the things that I'd like to bring up is that the complexity that went into the design of the Central Arizona project, if we could apply that same level of complexity to looking at the bigger picture, the same energy that went into the Central Arizona project into creating a positive way of looking at what we're doing in the American Southwest, we'd be getting somewhere. I have a very hard time with the CAP, which is not news to anybody but at any rate, I thank you so much. That Sonia's chapter in our book really gets into the Central Arizona project and the incredible effect that it's had on Native American peoples. And I want to make a small addendum here. When we started the Black Mesa Defense Fund at the request of both Hopi and Navajo people back in 1970, there were an awful lot of Navajo and Hopi people in those days who were vigorously opposed to the whole business of strip mining Black Mesa, which is a sacred mountain to both tribes. And not that long ago, part of my role in this lifetime is to record traditional music for different peoples, and I was recording a group of Navajo singers up near Kayenta. And their most highly revered medicine man in that group of singers was the guy who operated the drag line out on Black Mesa.
How about that?
It was truly one of those poignant moments. Wow. Well, we have a few issues. Actually, a couple of things came up. One of the things that I'd like to ask everybody to think about is the Endangered Species Act an endangered act at this point?
It doesn't seem like it's going away anytime soon, and what we're looking at. But what I would like to say about it is it really did transform the direction that reclamation has headed over in the last couple of decades, and it's gone at a pace that kind of slowly moved towards trying to manage for a single species to try to work that out, but folks quickly understood that it's really the degraded system that the species live in that needs the full attention, and that's where we're arriving at in how we're working within the context of the Middle Rio Grande ESA collaborative program. We need to elevate that to a higher level now to really live within the means that we have hydrologically, and then also to improve that habitat to allow for all the species that live in the river to survive.
Actually, the Rio Grande watershed's in better shape, isn't it, than the Colorado River watershed?
It depends on which part. I mean, if you go below Caballo Reservoir, it's a plumbing system, and they turn it off in the fall when there's no river, and they turn it back on in the spring when there's enough water to irrigate. So it depends
There's a
on where you are.
Morales Dam down there.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Actually, I've seen the river with no water down there last year, and it's pretty startling. One of the things I'd like to ask folks to think about, a friend of mine once said somebody should write a book about the relationship between water and electricity in the American Southwest. And one of the thoughts that's come to mind, and you brought this up, John, Lake Mead's 1.5 feet away from the lowest, and if it gets too much lower, it's not inconceivable that it wouldn't be able to turn the hydroelectric generators. Mm-hmm. And the same holds for the Glen Canyon Dam. If those lakes get too low, they simply can't turn the turbines that generate the electricity, and we have an enormous reliance on the electricity. One of the things that Sonia alluded to was the notion of the cash register dams, and those are the dams like the bridge in Marble Canyon that didn't get constructed. But the notion was they could make electricity that could be sold. Now, what my big worry is, I mean, this is one of the myriad nightmares that we think about in this business, is what happens if they can't get the electricity from both Glen and Hoover dams. Because we do have enormous coal deposits in the American Southwest, and even though Obama And the Environmental Protection Agency has sort of put the no-no on construction of more coal-fired power plants. Could that possibly be, does anybody have a sense of how that might be overturned in case the hydroelectric power might be threatened? See, this is one of the things that I think is that we have to imagine these possible scenarios because here we are. I mean, we're us folks here in the Rio Grande watershed, and there are those folks over in the Colorado River watershed, and now because of inter-basin transfers of water, we're all one big interrelated gang of folks, and John really pointed that out very well. And what we need to do, I think, is begin to really become much more involved within our home watersheds, because we have probably, like you would have a clearer picture than, say, somebody in Washington would, Mike, with regard to what's happening here. And so I think we should vigorously try to get all of us involved in any of this. I had a list of issues. Well, what sort of compromises? This is, John just had an article in yesterday's, was it? Yeah, yesterday's Albuquerque Journal, which was very good, that focused on what's happening right here in the Rio Grande and all of these potentially volatile situations. And so one of the issues that I wanted to bring up for everybody to think about and address is what sort of compromises do we envision within New Mexico that are necessary to address? And I would like to bring out agriculture versus urban. Let's start there.
One of the things that, I go back to the Colorado River Basin because I think it's a model, and because I think this conversation is much farther along in the Colorado River Basin than it is here. One of the conversations that's going on in the Colorado River Basin now is the attempt, and sometimes with some success, to set up relationships between municipalities and farm water users, so that rather than fighting over the water, there's some collaboration. So, for example, the Palo Verde Irrigation District, some of the oldest rights on the lower Colorado River around Blythe, the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California pays a bunch of farmers a flat fee every year for the right to get their water in a dry year. So the farmer gets money every year. And when it's particularly dry, then the Metropolitan Water District says, okay, we're going to need water this year, and the farmer fallows her field for a year and gets essentially an amount of money equivalent to what they would have made farming to leave the land idle, and the money goes, the water goes to Southern California. The next year, when there's again enough water, the land goes back into production. So we're not taking land out of production. This is only one example. There's lots of different kinds of arrangements like this. There's a lot of creativity going on to try to come up with these collaborative sharing agreements, and they're tricky to pull off because you have to respect the economy of the place from which the water is coming. You have to do it in a way that third-party effects on, the tractor dealer are managed. So it's not easy to do, and it can be done badly. But there are things like that are contemplated as a new piece of legislation, the New Mexico, what's it called, Drought
Relief Act.
Drought Relief Act, Senator Udall introduced a couple of weeks ago, that contemplates setting up some structures to experiment with those sorts of things here, to try to figure out how to do it. It's not something you just wave a magic wand and happen. It takes a lot of collaboration and cooperation, and Mike talks about trust building. But there's room to do these things if, instead of fighting about water, we recognize that we're all in this together and figure out how we can come up with mutually beneficial arrangements.
That's great. I know that, oh, thanks, Jacobo. Wow. There are all of these issues. Wish we had about 4 hours to do this instead of an hour and a half. Here in the Rio Grande watershed, in your article, I think it came out to 4 times as much water used by agriculture as by the cities. Is there any sense of what crops are grown, or how does agriculture use its water
Is there any study of that?
There is a knowledge of the cropping patterns, the
Yeah.
historic cropping patterns that have gone on. It's a kind of an alfalfa, hay dominated type of agriculture in the Middle Valley. But there's a lot of, as you go a little farther south, there's a lot of farmers that grow the vegetable crops and the chili and the corn and some other crops. And I don't remember the exact ratios, but I would say that somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 60% is probably in the hay and alfalfa cropping pattern for the Middle Valley.
And where does that hay go? Does it get used here? Does it go elsewhere?
Well, it depends. There's a certain amount that's consumed in the area. There's folks that have learned how to, grow high dollar hay for racehorses and things that are outside of the basin, and they go ahead and deliver the hay in that direction. I know if you drive US 285 at all, you'll see large hay trucks coming from the San Luis Valley, one after another for year-round, delivering hay down to the Roswell area for dairy farms down in that neck of the woods. So you're using Colorado upper basin water to grow hay for dairy farms down in the Roswell Basin. That's a water short basin. So it's kind of an interesting concept that within the same area.
But it is a reciprocal thing here. I'd read somewhere a lot of the hay may go to China. Is that?
There's not much New Mexico hay going to China. The economics of hay have shipping distance issues. So there's sort of these overlapping economic spheres. So the hay in New Mexico kind of stays within a several hundred mile. It becomes uneconomical to ship beyond too many hundreds of miles. The Imperial Valley in Southern California and alfalfa in Central California is going back. These big shipping containers come to China with, cheap plastic goods for Walmart, and then the shipping containers go back empty, and so it's really cheap to just put hay in them and send them back. So the economics that's really driving a lot of alfalfa economics in California, but less so here. But it's a national market, so it spills over economically here.
That's fascinating. Hay going back. One of the things that I am concerned about is the coal that is mined in the American West. A lot of it is going to China at this point. And we may, in our own country, have created all of a sudden some pretty hefty regulations with regard to coal-fired power plants. But if coal is burned in China, it's going to affect our atmosphere here. And that's something we have to think about. I guess one of the biggest thoughts I have with regard to this whole subject is we look at water as a resource that's not as prevalent as it used to be. I know that when the Colorado River Compact was put together back in 1922, according to Norris Hundley, who did this wonderful book called The Great Thirst, it was thought that 17 million acre feet a year came down the Colorado River, and it's closer, I think, to 14 on the average, but we're having drier years. And so is there a sense, like in the work that you've been doing, John, is there a sense that people understand that growth, just endless growth, has to be gradually curtailed in order to be so that we can accommodate a human population with diminishing resources?
I think it's a more complicated discussion than that. If you look at the conversation across the West, there are people who would argue that. There are people who would argue that because of water scarcity, we need to curtail immigration from other countries. There are people who argue there's plenty of water for the humans that we have here, and lots more of them if we would just stop growing alfalfa. I mean, Colorado River Basin, 80% of the water is growing alfalfa and pasture, and we could double our population by just restricting alfalfa. And there's a lot of different ways you can get the math to pan out and figure out how to live with less water by doing less of any one of a number of things. The interesting thing is how do we collaboratively across these various communities with various different interests and various different values, how do we figure out which one of these solutions, or how to decide among these different solutions? I mean, we could easily decide, yeah, we don't think Phoenix should be there anymore. So that would work. That's one way of making the water mass balance. We could decide that Albuquerque shouldn't be here. That's another way to make the water mass balance. There's a lot of different ways you can make the water mass balance. The trick is, how do we as a society have the right kind of conversation to figure out how to balance all these different competing values and interests, and come up with a solution that fits in the spaces in between all that.
Well, that's precisely the point, really, because does it make sense that we vigorously invoke the local levels and have people look at it from all the various perspectives that we can possibly muster? In other words, so that it's not just economics driving it, or just not development driving it, or agriculture driving it, but all the ecosystem itself has been left out of the equation until just now, relatively speaking, over the last while. And I remember when I was doing that radio series on the Colorado River 13 years ago now, one of the water lawyers was very nervous about pitting the Endangered Species Act against another piece of legislation with regard to who gets what water. And so these are some of the questions that I think we really, what I'm just trying to invigorate more and more is that we all have to get into the discussion, because everybody has their own perspective and everybody has their own expertise. And that's basically what the humanities are all about, is bringing in as many of the different perspectives as we possibly can. That's why what Elaine Hebard is putting on this Saturday over in Dane Hall at UNM.
Dane Smith Hall.
I'm sorry?
Dane Smith Hall.
Dane Smith.
Room 120, right?
Yes.
Breakfast at 8:30, right?
Yeah. Coffee time. Anyway. Well, here's a question for Sonia. What effect will the closing of coal-fired stacks in the Four Corners area have on water and some of the native political issues you spoke of?
Well, if we close the coal-fired plants, we can stop the coal mining, and we can stop the environmental and cultural destruction that is happening in the wake of that coal mining. I also think that it would free, if we stop the coal, the generating stations, if we shut them down, it also frees up water that can be used in other ways that now are going to, those 23 million gallons of water that the Navajo generating station chews up per minute. It automatically frees that up that could be used, for the rest of us, and so I think those would be the biggest benefits in my mind.
One of the things that comes to mind, and I've seen this happen over the last 2 generations, is the focus among the Navajos has been ever more economically oriented.
Right.
And that's not just true for the Navajos, that's for just about everybody we know. And it's as though economics has driven absolutely everything. And it seems to me that we have pitted economics against ecologically sound thinking in a way that's not healthy. And so the optimism that was generated here so far this evening, if we can start to understand that economics itself is but one factor in this huge, bigger picture, that would be really good to note, I think. Okay, the hard part for my aging eyes is, although I must say that the handwriting is not as bad as it was last week. This is for Mike. Are there any plans for mandatory water conservation measures, household, agriculture, and industrial? Currently, it seems to be only voluntary.
That's a question near and dear to my heart, because I was with the city of Santa Fe as the original water director when the city bought the utility from PNM. And that transition from a privately held, profit-oriented water utility to a public welfare organized entity allowed us to actually deal with mandatory water conservation at the municipal level. When we were up against the wall in '97, we were able to convince the community, even the economic components of the community, the business community, that it was imperative that we implemented water conservation, mandatory water conservation rules to allow us the time to fully plan and develop the water system. And it's amazing, the city rose to the occasion, and they were running about 140 gallons per capita per day at that time, and reduced it down to below 90 gallons per capita per day in a very short period of time. It was pretty incredible. And so people do understand that we have a lavish use of water in most cases, and there's plenty of room for some mandatory conservation. And I think Albuquerque's done the same thing. I actually took out my lawn here last year because I was using quite a 10,000 gallons a month in the summer just on my lawn, and that was ridiculous. So those are the kinds of things that are happening, and the rules that are implemented at that level to encourage folks to make those changes are developing rapidly, actually.
That's really great. I know that Bill DuBuis, when he made his presentation here over 4 months ago, or in February at any rate, one of his things is that he claims that you shouldn't conserve water because that just makes water available for more development. And it's one of those strange thoughts that Brother DuBuis came up with, which is, it makes sense if you're Bill DuBuis.
Well, and I would like to say too that at least at the federal level, I'm not sure if the question was aimed at should the feds, come in with a heavy hand and require conservation. I think we encourage it. Reclamation has an extensive water conservation program where we look at the possibilities of how federal resources can encourage folks, both in the irrigation community and the municipalities, to go ahead and implement water conservation programs.
The city of Albuquerque continues to approve large development on the West Mesa. How can they do this with our scarcity of water?
Good question.
We're all wondering that.
Is it part of the juggernaut of the economic paradigm that we think we can continue to develop and we're in denial? We're in denial into Rio Grande. That's a very bad joke if you listen. Well, it's one of those unanswerable questions. In other words, maybe it would be good to talk to the city council vigorously about the whole sense of continued growth relative to the amount of water that is necessary to maintain right now relative to what it's going to have to maintain in the future. These are big questions. Development to me is one of the biggest issues. I know up in Santa Fe, I live up there, and thinking about development, and thinking about the waning aquifers. And I feel really pretty good from what you had to say that the city of Santa Fe is now relying more on surface water than groundwater. Mm-hmm. That's a huge factor. And like we talked about in an earlier one of these gatherings, it used to be until 1982 that the city of Albuquerque thought that it rested over the equivalent of Lake Superior or some such. And then it was proven otherwise. The cones of depression are depressing. Anyway, another question for Sonia. Do the Navajo regret
making priorities of coal-fueled energy over water rights?
I think the Central Arizona case, in that particular case, they clearly, in fact, the quote that I read from Annie Dodge Wanika, part of that quote, that's not in this part of the paper, but she actually says that hydropower is a thing of the past, and coal-fired power plants are the future. And, so at that time period, absolutely they saw coal, trumping water.
Wow. Whew. Here's one. Do isotopes leak into the Rio Grande from the Chama drinking water?
Chama drinking water. Well, there's evidence that Los Alamos isotopes are migrating towards the Rio Grande. Los Alamos Labs has an extensive network of observation wells that show that it has migrated into the deeper aquifer that is connected to the Rio Grande. And so they designed, the city of Santa Fe designed their diversion and treatment system to deal with the isotopes that do come in the Los Alamos.
Well, then here's another one. A comment on the fuel spill at Kirtland Air Force Base and effects on aquifers.
So the Kirtland fuel spill, for those who aren't familiar with the Kirtland Air Force Base, discovered in 1999 or possibly earlier that an underground fuel line for fueling aircraft had been leaking for decades, probably since the 1950s. A really massive contamination, certainly the largest contamination in the metro area, one of the largest in groundwater contamination in the state of New Mexico. It's moving, creeping slowly northward toward Albuquerque, Bernalillo County Water Utility Authority's Ridgecrest well field. And I think I would argue not enough is being done to clean it up or slow its spread to protect those wells. And the threat is not an immediate public health threat. Test the wells regularly, the wells are clean. We have a reasonable idea of where it is. What the real threat here is the loss of a huge water reserve. This groundwater becomes unusable. It's essentially a water supply problem because we have the ability to detect it and shut down wells and stop using the section of the aquifer. We don't want to do that. This is incredibly valuable water, and I think that's where the real problem is there, and also the long-range possibility that we could recharge that aquifer. It's a place where we can store water. We can put water down there in years of surplus to withdrawal. And this area happens to be one of the best places where one could do that, and it's probably lost to that possible use.
I know that that Pat Mulroy years ago told me about the whole notion of water banking. And Las Vegas, she was the director for the Southern Nevada Water Authority, and a really bright lady who John told me the other day is just retired, and I always thought that she'd be a really good candidate for Secretary of the Interior. She's a smart lady. But she's also come up with this notion, much to the dismay of a bunch of my rancher friends up in the Great Basin Desert, of pumping water out of the Great Basin Desert into Las Vegas. Because Nevada got short shrifted in 1922. They only got 300,000 acre feet as an allocation annually from the Colorado River. And, but one of the things that Pat mentioned to me was this whole idea of water banking. It didn't work geophysically in Nevada, but it would work if water could be pumped into areas in Arizona where the geophysical structure, subterranean, would be capable of handling the water. And so one of the things that she was working on was working out a deal with Arizona to water bank Nevada water for the shortfall. And this is another act of mutual cooperation that people just have to be thinking about. I think that the whole situation with the Great Basin Desert That's something that was sort of popped on those folks up in the Great Basin Desert, and they didn't realize this was coming down the pike, that their aquifer, which is a closed basin, the Great Basin Desert is a closed basin. It's part of Nevada, northern Nevada, and Utah, and it's an incredible place. It's a high desert, about 5,000 feet. Sagebrush characterizes the vegetation, and it's a wonderful place. If the aquifer is pumped out for urban growth, this is the thing that we worry about. We have to factor the ecosystem back into the bigger picture. I had really wanted a nice way to end this series of things that we're doing. So I invited two wonderful friends of mine to come and perform a song. The song is called La Indita del Rio Grande, which to me is one of the most beautiful songs I've ever heard in my life. And if the local deities are beneficent, it will imminently be played by Chuy and Oti. I want to thank everybody here for people who have been coming and coming and coming to our presentations. And I hope that we've done some good. I hope that this has been worth having done. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce my two great friends, Chuy Martinez and Oti Ruiz. You made it. You made it. Oh, wow. Oh, here, let me put this on you. This is.
We made it on time.
Can
No, we don't have. We don't need it.
No, we don't need the microphone.
No.
Okay.
I think you guys can hear, right? You know, we did so many nights of theater in this place, and this place has some great acoustics. But we can, you know, Jack invited us to do a song, but he's going to have to help us out, either with the drum or what do you prefer?
Whatever you would rather perform on.
That's fine.
Oh, great. Gracias.
All right. Well, this is a very appropriate song. This is a song about New Mexico. What is New Mexico? How do we see New Mexico? The translation is, it talks about the mountains and the rivers. It talks about the green chili, the waters of the Rio Grande. And it says, oh, majestic Rio Grande, thank you for all the blessings that you give us with your waters as we irrigate our fields. And just like a soft rain, and endless soft rain, when I travel and I see the lightning and the clouds. And then it talks about the beautiful echoes in the mountains, where you can still hear the echoes of the ancient people. It talks about the enchanted land that gave birth to what it is now, New Mexico. And it talks about the sunsets, where God opened up his heart and let us see it every evening as we look at the sunset. Como lluvia interminable lloviendo sobre un papel. Como lluvia interminable lloviendo sobre un papel. Pájaros, truenos y rayos, alas de papel downtown, panajeo. Panajeo. Anahe, anahe, anaheo. Anahe, anahe, anaheo. es mi país. Nuevo México, mi tierra, mi raíz es mi país. Es mi orgullo haber crecido entre frijol, chile y maíz. Anaheim. Anaheim. Anaheim, Anaheim, Anaheim. Anaheim, Anaheim, Anaheim. Tierra madre del encanto, embarazada por el sol. Tierra madre del encanto, embarazada por el sol. Vida, luz, tierra y colores, aguas de arroyo cristal. Anaheim. Anaheim. Anaheim, Anaheim, Anaheim. Anaheim, Anaheim, Anaheim. Río Grande, generoso por tus venas aguadas. Río Grande, generoso por tus venas aguadas. Alimentas a tu gente con tanto vegetal. Anaheim. Anaheim. Anaheim, Anaheim, Anaheim. Anaheim, Anaheim, Anaheim. En tus montes se oyen voces silenciosas del pasado. En tus montes se oyen voces silenciosas del pasado. Son los cantos de los indios que alegre su vida dan. Anaheim. Anaheim. Anaheim, Anaheim, Anaheim. Anaheim, Anaheim, Anaheim. Es el cielo de tus tardes, el espejo del Creador. Es el cielo de tus tardes, el espejo del Creador. La sierra sangre de Cristo te enseña su corazón. Anaheim. Anaheim, Anaheim, Anaheim. Anaheim, Anaheim.